Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our special event, 3 Deans in Conversation. I don't think that's ever happened here before, so could we just give our Deans a warm round of applause for welcome? So it's my job to just kind of curate the evening, and I think I'm chosen because I'm the bossiest. And we're going to go in a strict kind of protocol. I'd like you to imagine that you're eavesdropping on a conversation, okay? Now, the difficult bit for you is you cannot interrupt or join in the conversation. I know it's torturous for some people in particular that you've got to just be quiet, okay? So we're going to have some short introductions. We're going to then drop a big question. Our speakers are going to speak into the question and then just chat, okay? I'm the timekeeper because I'm the bossiest. And at the end of 40 minutes, we're going to stop. Wherever we've got to, we're going to stop. Then there's going to be a 20-minute tea break. And people who've been to the Keen lectures and other events where I get to be bossy, you'll understand that's the point when you can write a question. Then I get the joy of only I ask the questions. Okay, so I get to discard anything that's nonsense. Anything where, basically means you can't speak and you can't become a lecturer. You can't become a speaker by default. So the best way to get your question asked is to write it so that I can read it. You can't tell that I'm a teacher at all. So, we have with us Dean Jessica, who you've all met and beginning to know. We have Dean Shelley-Ann from Trinidad and Tobago. We have Dean Mandy from Bristol. We are recording, but we're not going live. But just to warn you, this is being recorded. And I'm going to let, starting with Jessica, do a short introduction of themselves.
Hello, I'm Jessica Martin. I have been Dean of Chelmsford Cathedral for 7 weeks now. So, of course, I know absolutely everything about Chelmsford. Before I came here, I was residentiary canon for learning and outreach at Ely Cathedral, and I was there for 8 years. In terms of the subject that we're discussing today, Ely Cathedral has a slightly different kind of profile from the profiles of the other cathedrals that we'll hear about. Being stuck in the middle of an agricultural area with Wisbeach just up the road, the kinds of work that we did were very often around modern slavery, which is a big issue in the Fens with big agricultural businesses and with small ones. Wisbeach was where Thomas Clarkson grew up, the anti-slavery campaigner, and also where Olaudah Equiano settled in Soham, just south of Ely, and married his wife and had his 2 children. And his wife is buried in the churchyard in St Andrew's, Chesterton, in Cambridge. I did a little bit of work around the Fitzwilliam Museum exhibition called Black Atlantic, which looked at their own contested heritage. Most of what Ely Cathedral did was to offer prayer spaces and services that contemplated that particular history.
So I'm Mandy Ford. I have been Dean of Bristol since the early part of 2020. That will give you a little clue as to the rather peculiar beginning to my time as Dean. I was interviewed on Zoom in my study 1 month into the first COVID lockdown and did not see my cathedral until May of that year and was not installed in it until October, and my installation was attended by 30 people. So I was in London knowing that I was going to be the Dean of Bristol in the summer of 2020, when George Floyd was murdered and when the statue of Edward Colston was taken down from its plinth in the city centre of Bristol and ceremonially tipped into Bristol Dock. So although I knew when I was appointed that issues of diversity and inclusion were going to be important in my role, and that the cathedral had some issues around its own legacy of slavery to address, those two incidents significantly heightened the pressure to respond, and to respond well, and possibly to respond rapidly, although that is in fact what we chose not to do. When I arrived, one of the things that I discovered was that there had been a couple of attempts in the life of the cathedral, particularly around the anniversaries of the abolition bills, to address some of Bristol's engagement with transatlantic chattel enslavement, and they had been frankly disastrous. They were not black-led. Where consultation happened, it was often then overridden, and the culture of the city had not changed. It was changing very rapidly by the time I arrived in the autumn of 2020. One of the first people I met was a woman called Gloria Daniel, who explained to me that she was the descendant of an enslaved African. They could trace their family back to a man called John Isaac Daniel. The clue is in the name. He was given the name of his enslaver, his owner. And we began a really interesting dialogue about how the cathedral was going to respond to the presence in its building of a number of memorials which aggrandized men and women who had profited from the slave economy. And the Daniel family were one of those. Our Great East Window was put in the 1870s, dedicated to the Daniel family. The Daniel family were compensated at abolition for 4,425 souls. And they were not philanthropists. They were political wheelers and dealers. They exercised significant political power in Bristol. We also have a memorial window to Edward Colston, a great hero of the Victorian bourgeoisie in Bristol, but also someone deeply implicated through his connections with the Royal Africa Company with slavery. And we have a third kind of hotspot monument, which is to a member of the Codrington family. And those of you who know anything about the history of Barbados or the United Society for the Propagation of the Gospel may know that it was the Codringtons who left their plantation and the 200 slaves on it to USPG in the 18th century. So I inherited all of that. And the first thing that we did was actually to dig a bit deeper, find out what was going on across the whole of the cathedral. We did some research. We uncovered the fact that about 20% of the people who are buried in our cathedral or memorialised there have a first-generation connection. either they were plantation owners or we can show that they were compensated at abolition. So as I often say to people, if you were middle class in Bristol in the 18th, early 19th century, and you put your money in a bank, you wore cotton clothes, you put sugar in your tea, you were deeply implicated in this heinous and horrible exploitation of black bodies. And that's really important. So we have, since that time, been working on a programme that has been really beginning to address some of those things. And it's my great joy and privilege to lead that work for Bristol Cathedral, and sometimes to listen to some quite hard truths from our sisters and brothers from the African and the African diaspora.
So I'm Shelley-Ann Tenia, Dean of Trinidad and Tobago. I was installed in March of 2008. 2018, my bad, not 2008, God please, no. 2018, so it's been 7 years since I've been there. You know, it's a funny thing. So the cathedral actually was the first Anglican church on the island in 1801 when Britain basically took occupation of Trinidad and Tobago. Well, Trinidad, because Trinidad and Tobago were not always one country. That emerged in the late 1800s when they kind of got connected. But before that, they were very separate countries, both administered from the Diocese of Barbados, as a matter of fact. And so it was Holy Trinity Church, and it was built specifically to minister to the planters and all those who were connected to them, essentially. So we became a cathedral when the diocese became a diocese, actually. So that would have been a good 50 years after the Holy Trinity Church had been built. And that's a reality for all of Trinidad and Tobago in general as well. Because the deal is that the Spanish had us, then Britain had us. Tobago, on the other hand, had changed hands close to 30 times, over and over, by a range of colonizers. Trinidad did not have that reality. We had the Spanish for more than 200 years, and then the British, with great French influence, because in the Cabildo system, because the French were Roman Catholic, French planters from up the islands were given large tracts of land to come, and incentive to come to Trinidad to be there, essentially. So that by the time we became a cathedral, there was a governor by the name of Ralph Woodford, who was really the second governor, and he was of the view that the British needed to establish its presence on the island in a grand way, and the church had burnt, like most everything in Port of Spain, which is the capital city, and so he took it upon himself to rebuild the church that then became the cathedral, and to also rebuild the Roman Catholic Church with the money that was sent from England. Now, the intention was that our building would be the one cathedral on the island to service both the Roman Catholics and the Anglicans. And Woodford was clear that he was not doing that because Spain had had its dominance for a long time and wanted to establish that the English church was the English church. And so he built two churches, essentially. So as it relates to what happens in Port of Spain, Woodford and some of the other planters in many ways were revered because they did so much for the city. Yes, they contributed considerably to the building of the city, actually. And what that meant for us as Anglicans, especially as Britain took over, is that the church became the space of privilege, fundamentally, because the church and the government were one. So there was nothing to contest, really. And so the Anglican Church in Trinidad and eventually Tobago had a great deal of power and a great deal of privilege, and still does, even though we've been disestablished for a long time, since 1962. But the truth is, because the systems were in place for so long, we still carry some of that privilege and power that exists. So that you find that people are not necessarily up in arms or having issues with much of anything, really, except in response to challenges as the conversations about reparations and the conversations around heritage have emerged over the years. And in my own reality, as I have entered the cathedral and having led in a time where we had a bad earthquake that closed the building down, and we had to figure out how to reopen, figure out how to be church outside of a church, we have two things that are of significance that I think contribute to the conversation, and those are a huge bust of Ralph Woodford, who, by the way, while he did a lot for Port of Spain and built the cathedral, was not in favor of emancipation, was a slave owner and supported slavery, and did not want to have anything to do with manumission at all. And then the building still has a slave altar. So when he built the building, the slaves were allowed to come to worship, but they could not go to the high altar. So he created a chapel for slaves at the west door. I mean, we call it the All Souls altar now, but the point is, it's there, and they are juxtaposed to each other. And so for me, since I've been at the cathedral, that has been the way in which I've led that conversation. That both matter, both are important, lest we forget, essentially.
Thank you very much.
I think it's on.
So, thank you very much, because that really sets the scene for everybody as to who you are and the things that you've been dealing with. So the question that we're going to look at is there such a thing as contested heritage, and why are we using language like that? So, again, you're each going to speak into that, and then the conversation will emerge, the lights will go down, the fire will start to roar, and you will just be in conversation. So the order we agreed for the next step is Shelley-Ann, Mandy, and then Jessica. So just 5 minutes each, and then the conversation as the lights dim and it gets cozy.
As the movie starts. So as I would have shared, there was not a sense of anything to contest in our context. So we don't even use the language of contested heritage. Actually, what the folks who do the work in terms of preserving and archiving and so on, what they talk about is actually shared heritage or displaced heritage. Shared heritage from the perspective that what was brought and was left has informed who we are and our understanding of our systems and who we are as a people. But there were parts of that that were taken away when the colonists left. And so because they took away parts of the information, there are pieces of our puzzle that we cannot complete. Because when we know that they have the records because they were there and they took them, but when we ask for them to complete our puzzle, they refuse to share. And we are told, well, we don't have that, we don't know what you're talking about. And our historians are often like, but that makes no sense. You were here, we have the evidence that you were here, you left. These things left with you, they have to be somewhere, right? But that's how we talk about that. Or displaced heritage, the things that were ignored, but that have informed our reality. And so I don't have anybody knocking on my door saying that I should pull out Ralph Woodford out of my building, actually. There is a statue of Picton, who was a general, who was actually brutal in his treatment of slaves and people in general. And he might be the only person in Port of Spain, because there's a statue of him in Port of Spain, that people kind of are upset about because of his brutality. But outside of that, I mean, we have in many ways embraced the European end of our history. And the Cathedral, as a matter of fact, is seen as a Grade 1 heritage building. It is actually seen as part of the nation's history. And so while people don't necessarily worship there all the time, there are lots of citizens who admire the building and own it as part of the nation's history in that way. And as you walk in, what you see is all of the great limestone, because it's a neo-Gothic building. We have 9 Morris windows. So a lot of work went into building the building, but it is also a historical monument for the nation, because a lot of the plaques tell us when some of the great diseases passed through the island, because you see memorials to the families of persons who died during the various those epidemics. And all of the limestone that's in the building was actually quarried in the quarries of Port of Spain by the slaves that Woodford used to build the building. So there's a sense that the nation's history, the history of Port of Spain and the history of the nation is there. In addition, the cathedral is the largest worship space on the island, actually. And so architecturally, it is revered and admired greatly. And so for me, and for the conversation that we've been having, that's why it's important to hold both together. Yes, in that sense.
Thanks, Shelley-Ann. So much of that is familiar from the Bristol context. The cathedral was the smallest cathedral building in England until 1870. It existed without a nave from its beginnings in the 1540s, and it was the kind of great bourgeois business people of Bristol who wanted to expand the cathedral again and build the nave, and those were the very same people who were aggrandizing folk like Edward Colston. So that sense of a building which carries messages about power and influence, I recognise very strongly. However, in Bristol, all of that is contested. There is a much stronger sense that the story that is told is not the story of the city. It's not the story that its citizens want to own and feel pride in. And that makes for a much more complex engagement with a very wide range of stakeholders. Many of you will be aware of some of the challenges around the use of Colston's name in the city of Bristol. So our major concert hall, for example, several of our schools have changed their names in the past 5 years or so. And I think that it's, from my perspective, as somebody who's interested in narrative and in interpretation and history, all that we're seeing is the way in which history is continuously being reassessed, rewritten, as the people who are telling the story change. So, you know, in the Victorian period, it was the white middle class of Bristol. Now it's a more diverse group of people, and just as Shelley-Ann was talking about the slaves who quarried the limestone, one of the things that I often say about Bristol Cathedral is that the only working class person portrayed there is Jesus. you know, and there aren't many women either, although we have a good smattering of Victorian worthies. But I think that's seeing that task holistically as trying to tell a bigger story feels really important. But I'm very conscious of those for whom telling that bigger story reflects loss, because the school that you went to isn't called the same thing anymore. The building that you came to for your school commemoration day doesn't look the same, doesn't tell the same story about who it is. And that's painful for those who have held that power and privilege in the past. On the other hand, we are becoming a space where our African, and particularly our African Caribbean community, are beginning to see themselves reflected and to feel at home. And just a small example of that, Paul Stevenson, son of the city, incredibly important campaigner for racial equality and racial justice. We held the memorial service after his death in January, and that was a congregation which was 90% black. And that I really think that could not have happened 10 years ago. So the story is changing, but it's not straightforward. And if it was straightforward, the answers would be easy. The view of those who look to the Caribbean for their heritage, and many of whom are Anglicans, is very, very different from the large numbers of Rastafarians, for example, in Bristol, people who would trace their heritage much more directly back, who would take a much more political Pan-African view, and trying to hold that tension together in terms of the story you tell is a challenge in itself.
It is.
I think I want to pick up from what Mandy said about history. History is always told by the people who know that they have a voice, and it's always told to an audience which they think they can envisage, and often they're right. When other voices tell that story, they expand it. They show things that you couldn't see before. They change but in changing the perspective, the eyes through which you see, you get a completely different set of perspectives on how that particular story was experienced by a larger group of people. That seems to me to be a wholly good thing. What I am much less at ease with is the idea that the retold story then disappears a series of difficult truths. And you might do it for terribly good reasons. You might say that to tell that bit of the story is to aggrandize or to give airtime to something that we should only be ashamed of or should forget. But I think it is dangerous to forget history. It needs to be remembered, it needs to be it needs to be learnt from. I'm going to give a really ancient example that's not an example to do with this particular story, and it's not a Chelmsford example, it's an Ely example. So in the 11th century in Ely, the East Anglians were a defeated people. They were the last place to be defeated by the Normans. And the only reason that Ely and its environs hadn't fallen to the Normans was because it was basically impassable marsh. And unless you got someone to guide you through it, you couldn't get there. But eventually it fell along with everywhere else. And the monks at Ely Abbey were blamed by the Normans because they thought, probably correctly, that they had helped they'd helped the resistance. So they said, okay, we're going to make you build an enormous, frowning, dominant building that you'll be able to see for miles around because you're on the only hill. And we're going to make you do it at your own expense. And whenever anyone looks up at that hill, they will say, the Normans have arrived and they're dominating the space. That building is Ely Cathedral. And its meanings for the 12th century, it took 100 years to build the nave, were the meanings of dominance and greed. There were people saying, we're here to stay, you are our vassals now. Now, when we inhabit that building, it's also the house of God. It can have other meanings. It has, over the centuries, had other meanings. But that's where it started. And I often think about that as someone who ministered there, because, you know, you can't look at it or walk into it without noticing that one of the things it says is, you are so small. And it might be saying that because you're so small in relation to the majesty of God, and that's what we often say. But it's also saying, you are so small compared to us because we've won. And so meanings can change, but I don't think history should disappear.
So I wonder if there's something around the idea of buildings as sites of conscience and how we amplify that sense of this can be a place where you can sit with difficult truths.
Yes,
absolutely, and I think it's the holding of the tension. I remember Archdeacon Chris, when he visited for our 200th anniversary, and we took him into the cathedral that we had then closed, and he asked about Woodford, and I was explaining about what used to be called the slave altar, which we've renamed, and that's my point about meanings changing, but not forgetting, because we now call it the All Souls altar, or the All Souls chapel area. And, you know, he was like, wow, you know, how do you all deal with this? And I said, well, right now we don't, because it's not a thing. But in the climate that we're in, I am aware that it may become a thing. And I'm prepared for it to become a thing because I'm already clear about how we're going to deal with that. Because I'm going to say to folks, you have to sit in your discomfort. Because if this is to represent who we are as a nation, as a heritage site for our country, then we cannot erase any of what was here. And for as difficult it was, and as ugly as Ralph Woodford was as a human being in terms of how he treated slaves, we cannot deny his generosity and the brilliance of his architectural sensibilities and the like. And so we have to sit and hold all of that intention and figure out how we do not repeat. How do we not repeat the things that have gone before us? And to help people understand that while we revel in the power and the authority and the dominance that we have, I mean, to this day, there is an insistence that the opening of the law tomb happens at the cathedral. The building is closed, and they still insist that the Anglican Church leads the worship. So they're doing it in a different space, but they're still wanting us to lead. Now that represents the power, the authority, the dominance and prominence. And we keep doing it because we understand that the connection is a strong one, but at the same time, to remind folks that the same law, the same legislature, the same judiciary that represents all of that power and the connection from colonial times, it is that same judiciary who is charged to do justice. And that as church, we will challenge our lawyers and our judges and our magistrates to do what is just and what is right. And so we make the space for people to sit with the uncomfortable truths and to hear all sides of the story, not just one, not just the dominant one, but all sides of the story. And I think that's important.
I think one of the things that we've had to reflect on in the Bristol context is that within the context of the cathedral, everything needs interpreting. Nothing is immediately offensive. Whereas the diocese also owns a closed church, as it happens, where Colston is buried. And we've had some very interesting conversations around the limits of tolerance and the limits of discomfort, and whether that space can ever be, as it were, a place where people who have been impacted by the very long legacy of slavery and systemic racism could ever feel comfortable. And that's a really interesting conversation in terms of where we go with that.
Absolutely.
I think what I really noticed, Shelley-Ann, in how you're talking is this clear-eyed recognition of the mixedness of human beings. It's so tempting, I think, to say there's purity over here and then there's reprobation over here, and we'll just sort of sort people out. And we'll put some people over there and some people over there, and we'll only talk to the pure.
Yeah.
And then you find that it's actually extraordinarily difficult because everybody's implicated and everybody has virtues. And so before you know where you are, you don't know how to do your sorting, and you don't know who you're able to speak about or speak to or think about or memorialize or be proud of or be ashamed of. You find that you could be proud of the same person that you're ashamed of and ashamed of the same person you're proud of. And as Christians, we kind of might know that from the inside as well, because that is the human heart.
Yeah.
It's a really mixed bag.
Yeah. And I think Mandy was so right when she talked about the complexity of the thing. Because even as we think about the process of colonization, right? And how different places were colonized and what happened to various bodies, those realities are very different. Even in the Caribbean, what happened in Jamaica and Haiti is very different from what happened in Trinidad or Tobago or Barbados. Very, very, very different from beginning to end. From how the process of slavery happened to the process of emancipation and then receiving our independence. And what happened in the Caribbean is very different from what happened in the United States, particularly the southern United States. And so we have this idea that it is all just kind of one big easy blob to sort, and it's not, because those differences have a huge impact on how we see the world, how we interpret what is our history, and then how we respond in the present moment. And I think we need to honor each other enough.
And picking up on Jessica's point, I think doing that as sisters and brothers of the same faith, yes, and in this case, the same historic tradition, to understand how we can see this as a shared history, yes, in which we can all own our place and build a better future.
Absolutely.
It seems like a really important task.
Absolutely.
But there's a lot of acknowledging the pain and the damage that needs to be done in order for us to do that work.
Absolutely, and that is across the board. That's why I was actually very grateful when I was talking to some folks who do this work all the time, and I said, okay, so what are you thinking about in terms of contested heritage? How do you have that conversation? They're like, we don't even use that language, and I was so grateful that what is used is this idea of shared heritage, or what might have been displaced. Because for me, that gives a whole different frame to work within, other than something that is antagonistic and conflictual necessarily, you know. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for allowing us to eavesdrop on your conversation. And thank you for responding to my hand signals. I'm very glad nobody else could see what I was doing. Thank you very much. That's been a really, really interesting conversation to listen to. We're going to take a 20-minute break. I'm hoping that the tea and coffee is there.
Nearly, I think.
Nearly there. If you would like to pose a question to the panel, the means to do that is to write it down and then I filter out the questions. So we're also looking at train times, so we can't overrun. So if we convene back here at 8, and then there'll be 30 minutes for questions to be proposed. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So welcome back, everybody. This is the second part of the evening. I don't know, some people. We've got a strict 30 minutes because at 8:30, Mandy has got to go and get her train. Otherwise, instead of ending up in Bristol, she's stuffed with staying in Chelmsford all night. So, not that that wouldn't be a pleasant experience, but...
It would be a lovely experience, except that I have to be in a meeting at 8 o'clock in Bristol tomorrow morning, and that is physically impossible with them unless I go tonight.
So well, I'm in charge, so it will finish in time. So, to all three of you to have a go answering the question. So, they haven't seen any of the questions, they don't get to pick them, I do. What does it mean to be a cathedral, given the way heritage is expressed in each of your contexts? What does it mean to be a cathedral?
Who's going to go first?
I think if I just take a quick stab at that, I think for us, to be the cathedral is to be, from a national standpoint, a heritage space, a reminder of the history of the building of a nation in many ways, and that's an important thing. It is also for many a place of pilgrimage because it is in the middle of the capital city. So people come from all over Trinidad and Tobago to the cathedral, and people of all different faiths. So Trinidad is full of various religions, and so Hindus come to the cathedral, sometimes Muslims pass through depending on what their reality is. So it's everybody under the sun. It's kind of everybody's cathedral. So it's a place of pilgrimage and prayer in the center of the city. And because it is in the heritage space of the capital city, right opposite the Hall of Justice, adjacent to the Parliament, and next to one of the busiest commercial streets in Port of Spain, people also see it in an iconic kind of way. And so for me, it's all of those things, as well as being diocesan identity as Anglicans.
Thank you.
So, Jessica, go.
I'm still learning what it means because it's early days. I'm very mindful that although this is a cathedral that's stuck in the kind of geographical centre of a diocese, it's also one that is trying to hold a very different lived realities, very different lives, very different social contexts across the great swathe of the diocese. And for many within the diocese, it is an unutterably distant place. For those who are nearby, it is clearly a place of refuge, of peace, of prayer. I have never Anywhere else I have ministered, seen so many young men praying as I see in this building. And that is something that moves me every time. So it clearly acts as a place of almost of sanctuary. It also is surrounded by civic buildings. It's got the police station over there. It's got the Crown Court. It's got the Asylum Seekers Hotel. It's got the Homeless Hostel. And then it's got a load of kind of retail and leisure the other side. It's very peculiarly placed in its own context. And all those things add up to something that feels like a jigsaw puzzle with pieces missing. And I'm still trying to learn what that means.
Thank you.
What both of them said, and more. Cathedrals are extraordinarily complex places, and they are chameleon-like in some respects. And I think my sense has been, how do we maintain the sense that this is a place where people have worshipped for the last 900 years, but move away from assuming that every visitor wants a detailed historic analysis of the architecture. How do we make this a place where there is evidence of a living, breathing Christian community? How do we make this a space where those deep Christian values of generosity, hospitality, reconciliation are played out? And how do we do that attentive to those power dynamics, some of the less attractive parts of our history? So it's a great, rich, messy challenge.
Yes.
Super. Thank you very much. So question number 2. This doesn't go on for long. So the Church of England has created a £100 million fund to address the legacy of slavery. How would you hope this money, and possibly more, might begin to address the legacy of slavery?
Shall I start? Because we were just talking about this because Shelley-Ann was asking where we are with reparations in this country, and I've been in General Synod when this fund has been debated. And I also look at it from a very specific perspective from Bristol. In Bristol, if you are of African or African-Caribbean heritage, you are more likely to be unemployed, to have poor educational attainment, to die earlier, to live in poor housing, to have poor prospects. In other words, the red line from the exploitation of your ancestors to systemic racism is direct. And I would hope that one of the things that we will do with this funding is to begin to address some of that systemic inequality. Just to give you a very simple example, the most significant church where Anglican church where African-Caribbean people in our diocese worship really needs £1 million spent on it. Now, we don't have that kind of money in the diocese, but if we're serious about addressing some of those inequalities, then it's those kind of places where I would hope that some of that funding will go. But I'm also aware that from the perspective of the church commissioners, their hope is that some of that funding will go to addressing some of those inequalities in the Caribbean.
Yeah, and I think I have the same sense that I hope that it gets distributed in both directions for the same reasons. Because in our own context, for example, it's not just a building so we inherited these buildings, which really, they need the investment to be able to get them to a place where it makes sense. But outside of buildings, there is the repair of people, because we have generations of education that led to people seeing themselves and operating in ways that are oppressive. and that hasn't shifted. And so investment into programs for the rehabilitation of people's insides, the education systems, and other. The CARICOM has a 10-point plan that kind of addresses 10 areas that, if we are serious about reparative justice, investments can go into in those areas to support. And I think those are the kinds of things that can be helpful for the use of those resources. And I think that's not only true for Caribbean people or peoples from the African continent, but for descendants in areas here and in other places where systemic racism that is directly connected to the trade is real, you know.
Thank you.
I'm going to say this very tentatively. I think one of the things that I would like to say about the £100 million is that it is, amongst other things, symbolic. In that, if you were actually proposing to calculate the cost of what's owed, it wouldn't be £100 million. It would be infinitely more. And at the same time, I'm mindful that although it sounds like a lot of money, it's not actually going to go very far, even with the need that there is now. So there is a symbolic aspect to it. That doesn't stop it being really significant. It is a really significant symbolic act, and it will do some good. I tend to, I'm sorry, we're all agreeing with each other most dreadfully, really. I tend to agree that if it could go in both directions, given that it's not going to cover enough in either direction, then that makes the symbolic point in more than one way and in more than one place. So it's how to use it in ways that will be visibly useful and will point out some of the lacks.
You don't have to disagree. It's absolutely...
But I also think, as symbolic as it is, I think if it could be used as well, the symbolic action, as a catalyst for other spaces and people who also benefited from the trade in peoples and all of its byproducts, to contribute to that fund. So, okay, so we start the thing with £100 million, but can those who are the beneficiaries over many years keep contributing to it over time, so that it grows and that the work can continue to be done?
Thank you.
Because it took generations to get here, and it's going to take that long to repair.
Thank you very much. You all okay? So, what, in your experience, makes it easier or harder for people to accept that there are things to be ashamed of in a history they were taught to be proud of? Do you want to hear it again, or are you okay?
Can I have a go?
Go for it.
So, I don't know whether I can tackle the easier or harder bit, but I think I perhaps do want to say something about how people live with shame or with pride. Whatever it is that we hope to do in telling stories, if the only place you give for someone to inhabit in that story, which may not necessarily be their personal story and they may not necessarily have personally profited from it, is to be ashamed, then they will not participate in the story. So a story that only says you must feel shame is a story that is not going to engage enough people. That is why the mixed, messy middle of stories that are about virtue as well as about greed I think, are truer, but are also more wholly engaging than stories that maybe make some quite crude judgments about who is and isn't guilty.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think the thing that comes up for me with that is God had a choice about how God dealt with us in our story of how we dealt with each other and how we dealt with God over time. And God could have, even from the beginning, even in the first story, God could have said, well, you knew better. That was shameful. Why did you do that? Right? But God never did. God never pulled the shame card. Never. And so I think pulling the shame card is just another way to control a narrative, frankly. And so should there be regret? Yes. Should we lament? Yes. Should there be contrition? Yes. But I'm not sure that wearing the shame card is helpful, because where there is shame, there is no openness to transformation, to forgiveness, to change, because people just want to protect themselves in their shame. And that doesn't help. That has never helped us. And so I think if we can somehow lift the shame card off the table and have a more honest conversation about the reconciliatory process that needs to happen with true penitence and true restoration, I think that will make a huge difference in both directions, because the truth is, I mean, even in my context, while the oppressors or the colonists long left, and all I know are people like me in leadership, and I think that's why the Cathedral is such a big deal, because all of our leaders look like us. Those attitudes, those dominant attitudes that oppressed, are still attitudes that prevail. That we are still oppressing one another, even though we look like each other, because we have maintained the dominant culture mindset, yes, without challenge. And I think that's the work to be done. And that's where the healing needs to happen.
Thank you.
And I think at a very simple level, it's the way it works is to hear people's stories. I mean, some of the most profound times that I've spent in the last 2 years have been, sitting, eating soup with the Caribbean Elders Lunch Club, hearing those folk talk about their experiences of coming to this country in the 50s and 60s, and how they protected their children.
Absolutely.
And the attitudes that they inculcated in them, and just the respect for the dignity and the resilience of those folk, but also just hearing the stories has been, for me, part of why do I want to do this, even when it's deeply uncomfortable at times, because actually this is about individual people, it's not about people in the abstract.
And that there are some people who inhabit both spaces, yes, who are who live in both worlds, whose family history is made up of both. And how do we make space to hear their stories and to recognize that they struggle in the same way, and to bring healing across the board in that sense.
Thank you. One final question. Because of time constraints, you're going to have to have a pretty pithy, straightforward answer. Where do you personally see the signs of hope?
For me, it's because we keep having the conversation. And there is a sense of serious engagement with it. And I see that happening in so many aspects of life. So I see work happening in schools, in churches, in the civic space, and seeming to get some traction. So for me, those are the signs of hope, and
Thank you.
these kind of conversations.
Thank you.
I think for me, in my own context, just being with young people and hearing their interest, their desire for things to be different and not want to repeat the past, and being open to hearing all of it and being willing to act. So that for me is a sign of hope. And frankly, just being here, just being allowed to be here and to be invited to be part of this conversation and to share. I think, I don't know that would have happened 10, 20 years ago, frankly, on several levels, you know.
Thank you.
For me, it's encapsulated in this conversation. But also, I think about the world my youngest daughter lives in. She's under 20, just. And for her, some of the inbuilt prejudices that were part of my growing up just don't make sense.
To her.
Something changed. Something has changed. And that gives me hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go and sit down. Jessica, you go first, and then the final word rests with you.
All I have to say is thank you. Thank you so much for being willing to come, to have this conversation. Thank you for being so generous and so open with your time and with your thoughts. Thank you for making the journey. In each case, it's been not small. It's given me such hope and such pleasure, and I think I hope I speak for those who are sitting here as well. So, thank you both.
Thank you for having me. So shall we stand for the blessing as we go on our way? So may the strength of God pilot us. May the power of God preserve us. May the wisdom of God instruct us. May the shield of God defend us. May the hosts of God guard us against the snares of the enemy and the temptations of this world. May the Spirit of God carry us from this place, and may God's blessing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit rest and remain with each of us this night and forevermore. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
It's a real privilege to meet you.
You too.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was really good.
It was. Thank you all. Thank you.